Welcome back to High School History. I hope the previous videos where I have talked about the earlier themes from your Class 12 textbook has been useful in helping you revise for your exams. If you have liked the previous videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so that you can get regular updates as to my new video uploads. Now that we have it out of the way, let's look at theme 6, Bhakti and Sufi Traditions, changes in the religious beliefs and devotional texts from around the 8th century to the 18th century CE. Now, one of the most important things that emerges when we look at the 8th century religious beliefs, we see that there is an integration of cults which is happening, and there are two major processes at work. One, that the Brahmanical ideas are being disseminated through different ways, such as the Puranic texts in simple Sanskrit verse, which make it accessible to women and Shudras. So where the lower categories in society are accepting Brahmanical norms. The other process is about Brahmins accepting and reworking beliefs and practices of the localized communities. Right? So what this tells us is that there is a constant dialogue between what sociologists have described as the great Sanskritic Puranic traditions and the little traditions or the localized traditions. Now, the cult of Jagannath is an example of such an integration of cults. The cult of Jagannath we find originates in all probability in Orissa. And if you look at the iconography here, none of these gods look very familiar if you think about the Puranic pantheon. But what we today understand is that this particular image of Jagannath has been identified with Vishnu, or more particularly Krishna. But you do not see a Sudarshan Chakra or even a flute, right? So, what is this? So, perhaps the attributes of the local culture of Jagannath sort of match somewhere with the Vishnu slash Krishna cults of the larger, greater Sanskritic traditions as well. So, perhaps the Brahmins appropriated this localized cult and said, well, Jagannath is no other than Vishnu, Krishna. Often, there was no direct acceptance of the local gods and goddesses, but what they do is they kind of include them in a Puranic framework. For example, you may look at a goddess and say, okay, so this goddess is perhaps the wife of a certain principal male deity. So you have Lakshmi, who emerges as the wife of Vishnu. In other instances, we have Parvati, or a goddess with her attributes, who has been called the wife of Shiva. So we see a large number of cults being integrated with each other in this way. Perhaps the Dashavatar was also an example of such integration of cults. We had a lot of difference and conflict within these different cults as well. Like, especially when we compare Vedic and Puranic traditions, we see a huge amount of difference. Like, for example, in the Vedic traditions, we have some important gods such as Agni, Indra, and Soma. Now, they were really important gods in the Vedic traditions. But by the time you reach the Puranic traditions, Agni, Indra, and Soma are, very marginalized, minor gods, often in need of help from the new major deities such as Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh. Then again, when you go back to Vedic traditions, we hardly find any mentions of Vishnu or Shiva or the mother goddess, very few and far between references. But by the time we come to the Puranic period, we see that Vishnu and Shiva have become very major gods, and the tradition of the mother goddess has also expanded a great deal. There were also examples of conflict between these various religious beliefs. So you had the Vedic versus the Tantric. Now, the Vedic traditions were very strict in their rules and as to how you recite various mantras, whereas Tantricism was largely accessible to both men and women, and they also had a set of rules, but they were sometimes almost in opposition to the Vedic traditions. So the Vedic people never accepted the Tantric. They said they're too wild. The Tantric, they said, well, the Vedic traditions bind you like nothing else. Then you also have a juxtaposition between the Puranic or the Buddhist or Jain traditions. Yes, where the Buddhist and Jain traditions actually oppose a lot of the Puranic stories, especially those which deal with social hierarchies. And then you have the Puranic deities themselves being held in opposition to each other. Like, for example, Shaivism and Vaishnavism often were, quite inimical to each other. Now, we also see around the 8th century CE that the seeds of bhakti are being sown again through these three major cults, that is Shaivism, Vaishnavism, and Shaktism. Now, let's look at early traditions of bhakti. For that, we'll have to go to southern India and look at two major groups here. But when you look at bhakti, they challenge Brahmins as intermediaries. They talked about direct access to God. Bhakti also accommodated women and low caste. For example, women and low caste were welcomed in the bhakti fold. In fact, we have a large number of women and low caste saints also in these traditions. Now, when we look at bhakti, there are two large categories. So, one is Sagun bhakti, that is where God is seen as someone with attributes, right? So, there are specific attributes that you give to your God. So, Shiva, Vishnu, and his avatars, or the forms of the goddess or the Devi, who are conceptualized in somewhat human-like forms. So they would be Sagun Bhakti. For example, Krishna Bhakti or Ram Bhakti, they would be Sagun Bhakti. Then you have the Nirgun Bhakti, where God is shown without attributes, or God is worshipped in an abstract form. Especially when you look at Kabir and Nanak's teachings, here they look at God being formless, right? So they were following the Nirgun tradition. So, coming to southern India, you had two major streams of bhakts. One were the Alvars and others were the Nayanars. Now, the Alvars literally meant that they were immersed in the devotion of Vishnu. Uh, so, that's the sect they followed. The Nayanars, on the other hand, were Shaivites. Now, both the Alvars and the Nayanars would identify certain shrines, marking them as homes or abodes of their chosen deities. And often in the later period, the ruling class would get large temples constructed to mark out these sacred places. And these temples emerged as centers of pilgrimage. And singing of compositions of these poet saints also became part of temple rituals in these shrines. And the kings also began to install the saints' images in these temples as well, where prayers were also offered. So a number of South Indian temples, when you look at them, they really were hubs of the Bhakti movement. Now, what was the attitude of the Alvars and the Nayanars towards caste? Now, they all protested against the caste system. They were all against the domination of the Brahmins. And their followers included people from the highest levels to even untouchables. Now, one of the major anthologies of compositions by the Alvars, which is called the Nalayira Divya Prabandham, has often been described as a Tamil Veda. So, the Bhakti saints are also claiming that the texts that they produced were as important as the four Sanskrit Vedas themselves. As we said earlier, that the Bhakti movement was also open to women devotees and women saints. So, we have two very important women saints who emerged from southern India. One is Andal and the other is Karaikal Ammayar. So Andal was an Alvar, that is the beloved, she called herself the beloved of Vishnu, and wrote many poems describing her love for Vishnu. Karaikal Ammayar, on the other hand, was a Nayanar, or a devotee of Shiva, and she followed the path of extreme asceticism. Now, these women, when we look at them, they are really exceptional women because they renounce their social obligations. So, they would not be wives or daughters anymore. But at the same time, they did not join an alternative order or become nuns. They had kind of moved out of society, yet they did not want to belong to any community of renouncers. So, in fact, what scholars argue is that their very existence and their compositions actually pose a challenge to patriarchal norms. Yeah, so patriarchy didn't take very kindly to these kinds of women Bhakti saints. Now, what was the relationship of the Bhakti saints with the state? Now, when you look at the history of these movements, there are some major themes which emerge. One is that the Tamil Bhakti hymns often are in opposition to Buddhism and Jainism. So some scholars have argued that this was perhaps due to the competition between different members of the different members of the members of different religious traditions for royal patronage. Yes, so trying to win over a king's or a dynasty's support often could even mean the difference between survival and or the disappearance of a certain sect. Now, the Chola rulers, of course, patronized different gods at different times. So, most popular being Vishnu and Shiva. So they supported the Bhakti traditions and they made large land grants and even constructed temples for their chosen deities. Some of the most magnificent Shiva temples are at Chidambaram and Tanjavur, and also at Gangaikonda Cholapuram, and these were constructed under the patronage of Chola rulers. In fact, they even had produced spectacular images of Shiva in bronze. And if you remember from class 7, they used the lost wax technique, right? So clearly the visions of the Nayanars were inspiring the artists as well. Now, both Nayanars and Alvars, because of the message they preached, they were revered by the Velala farmers. Now, obviously, rulers needed the support of their farmers as well. So they tried to win over the support of the Bhakti saints, so that by extension, those who worshipped or respected these Bhakti saints would automatically become supporters of these rulers. The singing of Tamil Shaiva hymns in temples under royal patronage became quite popular, and the kings would take initiative to collect and organize all these hymns into a collective anthology of poems. We also have inscriptional evidence from around 945 CE that suggests that the Chola ruler Parantaka I had consecrated metal images of Appar, Sambandar, and Sundarar. These were some of the Nayanar Bhakti saints of the time in Shiva temples. And the images of these Bhakti saints were also carried in processions during the festivals of these saints, celebrating their birth and so on. Now, we also have the emanation of the Veerashaiva tradition, perhaps emanating out of the Nayanar tradition itself. Veerashaivas were also devotees of Shiva. They emerged around the 12th century in Karnataka. A Brahman called Basavanna is supposed to have been the founder of this community of bhaktas. And the word Veerashaiva means heroes of Shiva, and they're alternatively known as the Lingayats as well, or wearers of the Linga. Now, men usually wear a small linga in a silver case or a loop strung over the left shoulder, and they had great respect for Jangamas or wandering monks. Now, the Veerashaivas believe that on the death of a devotee, they'll be united with Shiva and won't return back into the world, and therefore their funerary practices are also quite different. So, instead of cremation, they actually bury their dead. They also challenged the idea of caste and pollution, that certain people were polluted and therefore impure and therefore needed to be kept out of society. They also questioned the theory of rebirth, because when they said that they will never return to this world if a Shiva devotee dies. And then, of course, they were quite progressive in the sense that they advocated post-puberty marriage and even the remarriage of widows. This was almost unheard of at that time. Now, we understand the Veerashaiva tradition from the vachanas, or the sayings composed in Kannada by men and women who joined the movement. Now, let's move on to northern India. Now, what is happening in northern India while the Bhakti movement is emerging in southern India? Now, northern India was in a state of flux, so we did have several Rajput states at this point of time, and in most of these states, it was the Brahmins who occupied positions of importance as very senior ministers and often performed a range of secular as well as ritual functions. But apart from the mainstream of the Brahmins, you also had the Naths, Jogis, and Siddhas, many of whom came from artisanal groups. So they had much more humble origins, including weavers. Weavers in northern India have always been considered to be low caste. So a lot of the Naths, Jogis, and Siddhas actually came from the weaving class as well. And they all questioned the authority of the Vedas. Now, the 8th century also marks the beginning of the first waves of the Turkish people coming in, and by the 13th century, the Delhi Sultanate is very well established and entrenched in northern India. And these bring about a whole lot of changes in the realm of culture and religion. And this is basically um, uh, facilitated by the advent of Islam and the coming of the Sufis. So let's look at Islamic traditions in northern India for a while. When we look at northern India and we look at these new rulers who are emerging now, so there is Muhammad Qasim, who's perhaps the first ruler of the Muslim ruler of the Indian subcontinent. He's the ruler of Sindh at that time, the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughals. Here, all the rulers were followers of Islam. But it didn't necessarily mean that their subjects were all Muslims as well. Now, according to the ulama, the Muslim rulers should have been guided by the Sharia and themselves. But of course, we know that in India, the Muslim rulers had a vast majority of non-Muslim subjects. These non-Muslim subjects were called the Zimmi. So the non-Muslim subjects were called Zimmi, or the protected, and they were expected to pay the jizya, or a kind of a protection tax, much hated in the later centuries, as we shall see in some of the subsequent chapters. Now, from what we see is that the rulers often adopted a very flexible policy towards their subjects. We have examples of several rulers, right from the Delhi Sultanate into the Mughals, who gave land endowments, granted tax exemptions to Hindus, Jains, Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jewish religious institutions. And they also expressed respect and devotion towards non-Muslim religious leaders as well. We know that Akbar made many such grants to non-Muslim religious leaders, including Aurangzeb, as you would have studied in one of the sources. Now, let's look at some of the popular practice of Islam in the subcontinent. Now, when we look at Islam within the Indian subcontinent, we see that different people of different social strata actually adopted Islam. So, they could be peasants, artisans, warriors, merchants, a whole variety of people. But one thing that was common between all Muslims, whether new converts or those who had come in from West Asia, was the 5 pillars of the faith. That is, that there is only one God, Allah, and Prophet Muhammad is his messenger. You should offer 5 prayers 5 times a day, give alms to the poor, fast during the month of Ramzan, and perform the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your lifetime. But we also see a lot of diversity, especially when we look at sectarian affiliations, for example, the Shias and the Sunnis. We also have local communities of Muslims who adopt local customs and traditions. For example, the Khojas, that is a branch of the Ismailis from the Shia sect, they developed new modes of communication where they disseminated ideas derived from the Quran through indigenous literary genres. For example, Ginan, meaning knowledge, or devotional poems in Punjabi, Multani, Sindhi, Kutchi, Hindi, and Gujarati. And these songs are often sung in special ragas during the daily prayer meetings in the mosque. Again, another example is that of the Arab Muslim traders who settled along the Malabar coast in Kerala. They adopted the local language of Malayalam. In fact, they translated the Quran into Malayalam. They even adopted local customs such as matrilineal, that is a lineage being considered through the mother's line, and matrilocal residence as well, something that was quite unfamiliar to the actual Islamic world. But there was also some universality and diversity. So the universal practices that we've seen were the 5 pillars of Islam, but there were some other things also which were very common, especially in the construction of mosques. So some common features were that the mosques were always oriented towards Mecca. So you would have the mihrab, which would point out the direction where Mecca was, so that the faithful could face Mecca while they offered their prayers. And also the minbar, or the pulpit, from where the religious leaders would give their sermons. But of course, we also see a lot of diversity in how these mosques were built in terms of the roof structure and building material. So if you look at this image, this is a mosque from Kerala. So this is a very traditional way of construction in Kerala. So they were using traditional methods of Kerala to build their mosques. Then this is, of course, one of the mosques from Kashmir. This is made of wood. And again, if you look at the roof, it's very different in structure. Yes, so this also has sloping roofs. Whereas if you look at Jama Masjid of Delhi, this structure is quite different from the other two, where you have a flat roof with domes and minars and so on and so forth, right? So so mosque kind of really came to exemplify both universality and the diversity of the Islamic religion. Now let's look at names for communities. Now when we look at the 8th to the 14th century, the term Musalman or Muslim was virtually never used when we look at the texts of the time. Instead, people were identified terms of the region that they came from. So the Turkish rulers were designated as Turushka, Tajika were the people who came from Tajikistan, and Parashika were people from Persia. Sometimes terms are also used for new migrants. For example, Turks and Afghans were referred to as the Shakas and Yavanas as well. Initially, where Yavanas came to signify the Greeks, but the old terms were being used to signify new migrants as well. We also have the term Lech, which indicates that these communities, migrant communities, did not observe the norms of a Brahmanical caste society and also spoke languages that were not derived from Sanskrit. Um, Today, of course, the term lecha has more derogatory connotations, but at that time, it didn't even signify a particular religion. I mean, lecha could be anybody who does not conform to Sanskritic language and caste norms, right? And the term Hindu also was non-existent in the 8th to the 14th centuries. And if it was used more in a regional sense. So anybody who came from the east of the Sindh River or from Hindustan was a Hindu, irrespective of what religious community they belonged to. Now, this brings us to Sufism. So, Sufism arrives in India almost at the same time as Islam. But if we go back to the history of Sufism a little bit, then a group of religious-minded people turn to asceticism and mysticism, especially when in the Middle East, the Islamic State came to be established, and they sort of revolted against the materialism and the hierarchical monarchies which came to be established in the Islamic world. They were critical of the dogmatic definitions and the scholastic methods of interpreting the Quran and Sunnah, and they laid emphasis more on seeking salvation through intense devotion and love for God, much like the Bhakti saints as well. And they regarded Prophet Muhammad as the perfect human being, and he was to be emulated by the people. So Sufis therefore sought the interpretation of the Quran on the basis of their personal experience. Now let's look at the Khankas and the Silsilas of the Sufi. Now, by the 11th century, Sufism has evolved into a well-developed movement with their own body of literature on Quranic studies and Sufi practices and rituals. Now, when the institution came up, the Sufis began to organize communities around the hospice or the Khanka. Khanka is where the preceptor or the Sufi saint would live. Now, the Khanka was controlled by a teaching master known as the Sheikh, Pir or Murshid, and he enrolled disciples or murids, and he would appoint a successor to take over after his death, often known as the Khalifa. Now, the Sheikh or the Pir or Murshid established rules for spiritual conduct and interaction between the inmates as well as visitors and the master. Now, when we come to the word silsila, it literally means an unbroken chain, which sort of signified, an unbroken spiritual link from Prophet Muhammad. And it was through this channel that the spiritual power and blessings would be transmitted to the devotees. Special rituals were created where the new initiates would take an oath of allegiance, they would wear a patched garment and shave their hair. And when the sheikh died, his tomb shrine or dargah became the center for devotion of his followers. And they began to practice ziyarat or pilgrimage, especially on the Sufi saint's death anniversary, or as it was called, urs or marriage. People believed that in death, since the saints were unified with God, they were thus closer to God, and therefore they could give a lot of blessings to help the devotees attain material and spiritual benefits. But there were also certain, you couldn't really call them saints, but preceptors you could call them. They were mystics who took Sufism to a more radical level. Now, they even scorned the Khanka, and they talked about complete renunciation, and they took to mendicancy and observed celibacy. They ignored rituals and observed extreme forms of asceticism. They were known by different names like Kalandars, Madaris, Malangs, Haidaris, and so on. And because their deliberate defiance of the Sharia, these people were often known as Be-Sharia or without Sharia, in contrast to the Ba-Sharia Sufi. So the Chishtis would come under Ba-Sharia. So that is, they would follow Islamic law to a great extent. Let's look at the Chishtis in the subcontinent in some more detail. Let's look at their daily life to begin with. So if you look at Sheikh Nizamuddin's hospice or the dargah, today it's in Delhi near Humayun's tomb. But at that time it was first built, the river Yamuna flowed very close to it. And this area was known as Ghiaspur. And it was at that time on the outskirts of the known city of Delhi. The contemporary times, you could place them perhaps along with the Tughlaqs. So if you look at the Tughlaqabad fort, today it's in the Saket region of Delhi. And Sheikh Nizamuddin Chishti's hospice was, of course, on the outskirts of what was known as Delhi at that time. So when you look at the dargah today, it comprises of several rooms and a big hall, or the Jamaat Khana, where the inmates and the visitors lived and prayed. So it's structured more like a mosque. The inmates included family members of the sheikh, his attendants, and disciples. The sheikh himself lived in a small room on the roof of the hall where he would meet visitors in the morning and evening. Then there is a large veranda which surrounds the courtyard, and there's a boundary wall which runs around the complex. It is also said that on one occasion, fearing a Mongol invasion, people from the neighboring areas actually flocked to the khanqa to seek refuge, because these khanqas were also seen as sacred spaces, and often, even during times of invasions and violence, uh, these khanqas were largely left alone. The khanqas also ran an open kitchen or a langar, which was run on fatuh or unasked for charity. From morning till late night, people from all walks of life would visit: soldiers, slaves, singers, merchants, poets, travelers, the rich and the poor, Hindu jogis and kalandars, and they all came to seek discipleship or amulets for healing, or asking the sheikh to intercede in various matters on their behalf to God. You also had some very famous visitors to Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah. For example, Amir Hassan Sidzi and Amir Khusro, and the court historian of the Delhi Sultanate, Ziauddin Barni, all of whom wrote about the Sheikh. The practices that the Sheikh adopted were bowing before the preceptor, offering water to visitors, shaving the heads of initiates, and yogic exercises. And these practices seem to represent the attempts of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia to assimilate the local traditions. Nizamuddin Aulia also appointed several spiritual successors, not just one, and deputed them to go to different parts of the subcontinent and set up hospices. So, as a result of this, his practices and the organization of the Chishtis, as well as the fame of the various Chishti sheikhs, spread rapidly across the subcontinent. Now, there were two very important constituents of Chishti devotionalism, that is ziyarat and qawwali. Now, ziyarat is pilgrimage to the tombs of the Sufi saints, and this practice is prevalent all over the Muslim world. And especially if you make this pilgrimage during the Sufis' urs, it's seen to bring you even more benefits. Now, some of the most revered shrines in India, of course, apart from the Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah in Delhi, is Khwaja Muinuddin's Dargah in Ajmer. He's popularly known as Gharib Nawaz, or the comforter of the poor. Now, he became popular because of his austerity and piety and the greatness of his spiritual successes as well. So, we know that Muhammad bin Tughlaq and Akbar were also royal visitors to Gharib Nawaz's Dargah. And the earliest construction of the Ajmer Dargah was perhaps funded by Sultan Ghiyasuddin Khalji of Malwa. Now, we know that Akbar went to Ajmer 14 times, sometimes multiple times in the same year, to seek for blessings for new conquests, fulfillment of vows, and the birth of sons. And he maintained this tradition till 1580. And each of the times that Akbar visited, it was celebrated by generous gifts, which were recorded in imperial documents. For example, in 1568, he offered a huge cauldron or a deg to facilitate cooking for pilgrims. So even today, when you go to Ajmer, you do see two of these very large degs, one of which was donated by Akbar. Now, part of ziyarat is also the use of music and dance and mystical chants to kind of move into a state of divine ecstasy. The music has often been known as qawwali. The Sufis remember God either through reciting the zikr or repeating the divine name, or invoking his presence through sama, or performance of mystical music. Sama was an integral part of the Chishti practice and exemplified interaction with indigenous devotional traditions. So even today, the tradition of the qawwals putting up special performances on Thursdays is very common and popular in the Chishti dargahs. Now, the Chishtis also made, not just the Chishti, but all Sufis made huge contributions to the development of language as well. So, for example, in Delhi, those who were associated with the Chishti Silsila, they conversed in Hindavi, which is a kind of predecessor of Hindi. Other Sufi saints such as Baba Farid composed verses in the local languages where they lived, and many of them have been incorporated in the Guru Granth Sahib as well. There were yet others who composed long poems or masnavis to express the idea of divine love using human love as an allegory. So we have Padmavat, which is actually a Premakhyan composed by Malik Muhammad Jaisi and revolved around the love between Padmini and Ratna Sen, right? Where it signified a divine love between devotee and God. And their trials were symbolic of the soul's journey to become united with the divine. There's another genre of Sufi poetry which was composed in and around the town of Bijapur in the Deccan. These were short poems in Dakkani, which is a variant of Urdu and has been attributed to Chishti Sufis. These poems were probably sung by women while performing household chores like grinding grain and spinning. There were other compositions in the form of Lori Nama or lullabies or Shadi Nama or wedding songs. And it is through the medium of the Sufis really that Islam gradually gains a place in the villages of the Deccan. Now, how do the Sufis connect with the state? Now, generally, Chishtis, we know, tried to maintain a distance from worldly power, but it was not, again, a situation of absolute isolation, because the Sufis were known to accept unsolicited grants of fatu from the political elite. The sultans, in turn, would set up charitable trusts and endowments for hospices and granted tax-free land so that the poor could be benefited. But the Sufi saints prefer to use, the income from all of these on immediate requirements such as food, clothes, living quarters, and ritual necessities. And the fact that they would spend everything that came also enhanced the moral authority of the sheikhs, which further attracted more people from all walks of life. The Sufi saints' piety and scholarship and the people's beliefs in their miraculous powers also made the Sufis popular among the masses. And this was the support that the kings wished to secure. So why would they want to do that? So when the Turks began to first set up the Delhi Sultanate, they realized that if they followed the injunctions of the ulama, they would have a full-fledged revolt of the non-Muslim subjects on their hands. So they tried to keep a distance from the ulama, but they would still need some sort of divine legitimacy. So that's when the Sultan sought out the Sufis, who were said to derive their authority directly from God. And it was believed that the Aulia could intercede with God in order to improve the material and spiritual conditions of human beings. And therefore, often kings would like to locate their tombs in the vicinity of Sufi shrines and hospices. For example, you have the Humayun's tomb, which is very close to the Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah. But there were also instances of conflict between the Sufi saints and the sultans. Now, to assert their authority, both the sultan and the Sufi would expect certain rituals to be performed, such as prostration and kissing of the feet. So this was a bit of a bone of contention between the sultans and the Sufis. Occasionally, the Sufi saint would even be addressed with high-sounding titles. For example, the disciples of Nizamuddin Aulia addressed him as Sultanul Mashaykh, or literally Sultan among sheikhs. And of course, the Delhi Sultan would not always take to it very kindly. Now, let's take this argument further and look at the emergence of bhakti in northern India as well, right? So, the first such bhakt that we will consider is going to be Kabir. So, what are the sources of information we have for Kabir? We have his own compositions and the hagiographies. Yes, what are hagiographies? Hagiographies are nothing but stories and biographies of various saints, which were often composed long after the Bhakti saint was had died. And often they would include, elements of miracles and some supernatural powers. So, verses that have been ascribed to Kabir have been compiled in three distinct traditions. One is the Kabir Bijak, which are preserved by the Kabir Panthis in Varanasi. Then you have the Kabir Granthavali, which is associated with the Dadu Panth in Rajasthan. And then many of his compositions have also been found in the Adi Granth Sahib. Now, Kabir's poems have survived in several languages and dialects, and some are composed in the special language of Nirgun poets, known as the Sant Bhasha. Then there was also something called the Ulat Bansi, or upside down sayings, which are written in the form of everyday meanings which are inverted. For example, you would have the lotus which blooms without flower, or the fire raging in the ocean. Now they would try to use these phrases, Kabir tried to use these phrases to explain the ultimate reality, which would be so difficult to explain in the first place. Now, Kabir also drew on a wide range of traditions, including to describe the ultimate reality, and these included, Islam, Vedantic traditions, yogic traditions, and so on. So he used the Islamic traditions to describe the ultimate reality as Allah, Khuda, Hazrat, and Pir. He used the ideals of monotheism and iconoclasm to attack Hindu polytheism and idol worship. He also used terms drawn from Vedantic traditions such as Alakh, Nirakar, Brahman, Atman, and so on. Then he also borrowed from yogic traditions where he talked about Shabd or Shunya, to explain what the divine was like. He also used the Sufi concept of Zikr and Ishq and even Naam Simran. So were all these poems, all these dohas that you may have studied in Hindi, were they all composed by Kabir? Now we can never be certain about that. Although scholars have tried to analyze the language, style, and content to establish which verses could be his, we can't always be very sure. But what is obvious is that Kabir is a present. It was in the past and even today, he's a source of inspiration of those people who question established religious and social norms and institutions. Now, Kabir's legacy, many people have tried to appropriate. So, we have the Vaishnav tradition, which attempts to suggest that he was born a Hindu, but he was raised by a poor Muslim family who belonged to the community of weavers or julahas, who had recently converted to Islam. They also suggest that he was initiated into bhakti by a guru, perhaps Ramanand. Now, in his own verses, Kabir does use the word guru and sadguru, but nowhere does he mention Ramanand. So it is difficult to establish if Ramanand was truly his guru. Even their timelines are, have quite a gap. This brings us to Baba Guru Nanak. He was also, like Kabir, a Nirgun Bhakti saint. Right, so if you look at his early life, Baba Guru Nanak was born in a Hindu merchant family in a village called Nankana Sahib. Today it is in Pakistan. He was trained to be an accountant and he studied Persian. He was married off by his family at a young age, but he spent most of his time among Sufis and Bhakts. Now, he advocated a form of Nirgun Bhakti, as mentioned earlier, and he repudiated all external practices which he considered to be meaningless. So, he rejected sacrifices and ritual baths, fasting, image worship, etc. For Guru Nanak, the absolute or God or Rab had no gender or form. He proposed a simple way to connect with the divine by remembering and repeating the divine name. He expressed his ideas through hymns called Shabad in Punjabi, and Baba Guru Nanak would sing these compositions in various ragas while his attendant Mardana would play the rabab. Baba Guru Nanak organized his followers into a community. He set up rules for congregational worship or sangat, and which involved collective recitation. He also appointed one of his disciples, Angad, to succeed him as the preceptor or the guru, and this practice was followed for nearly 200 years. After the death of Guru Nanak, of course, some changes take place. Guru Nanak did not wish to establish a new religion, but after his death, his followers consolidated their own practices and tried to distinguish themselves from both the Hindus and Muslims. The fifth preceptor, Guru Arjan Dev, he compiled Guru Nanak's hymns along with those of his four successors and some other religious poets like Baba Farid, Ravi Das, and even Kabir in the Adi Granth Sahib. And these hymns are called Gurbani, and we find them in various languages. In the late 17th century, the 10th and the last preceptor, Guru Gobind Singh, included the compositions of the 9th Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur as well, and this scripture was now called the Guru Granth Sahib. Guru Gobind Singh also laid the foundations of the Khalsa Panth, called the Army of the Pure, and defined its 5 symbols. So all Sikhs would now have to maintain these 5 symbols. So they would not cut their hair, they would carry a dagger with them, a pair of shorts, a comb, and a steel bangle. And under him, the community was consolidated as a social, religious, and military force. We now move towards the east, that is towards the west, and look at Mirabai, or the devotee princess. Now, she's perhaps the best known woman poet within the Bhakti tradition. Her biographies have been reconstructed primarily from the bhajans attributed to her, which were transmitted orally for centuries. Mirabai's biographies have been reconstructed primarily from the bhajans which were attributed to her and have been orally transmitted for centuries. Now, according to these, her own bhajans, she was a Rajput princess from Merta in Marwar who was married against her wishes to the prince of the Sisodia clan of Mewar, Rajasthan. She then goes on to defying her husband and doesn't submit to the traditional role of wife and mother. And instead, she recognizes Krishna, an avatar of Vishnu, as her lover. So when we look at Krishna here, we automatically know that Mirabai was a Sagun Bhakti saint. Traditionally, we have come to know that her in-laws tried to poison her, but she escaped from the palace to live as a wandering saint, composing songs that are characterized by intense expressions of emotion. According to some traditions, her preceptor was Raidas. Raidas was a leather worker and therefore an untouchable. And this indicates her defiance of norms of caste society as well. So after a point, she rejects the comforts of her husband's palace, and she's supposed to have donned the white robes of a widow or the saffron robes of the renouncer, depending on different communities, and she leaves the palace. And Mirabai does not attract a sect or group of followers like Kabir or like Guru Nanak, but she has been recognized as a source of inspiration for centuries. Her songs continue to be sung by women and men, especially those who are poor and considered low caste in Gujarat and Rajasthan. Now, when we reconstruct the histories of religious traditions, let's look at some of the features or some of the things that we need to keep in mind when we do that. So, historians draw on a variety of sources to reconstruct histories of religious traditions like sculpture, architecture, stories about religious preceptors, and the compositions attributed to women and men engaged in the quest of understanding the nature of divine. Now, already in some of your previous chapters, we have discussed how sculpture and architecture can only be understood if we have the grasp of the context, that we understand the ideas and the beliefs and practices of those people who produce these images and buildings. Now, another method to look at religious histories is by looking at religious texts, which include a variety of styles written in different languages, and they range from the apparently simple, direct languages of the Vachanas of Basavanna to the more ornate Persian of the Farmans of the Mughal emperor. Now, understanding each type of these texts requires a different skill set. So, apart from a familiarity with several languages, the historian also has to be aware of the subtle variants in style that each genre characterizes. To close the chapter, we know that all of these religious traditions that we've talked about, whether it's the Jagannath Puri or the Malangs or the Sufis or Kabir Panthis, Guru Nanak's teachings, Mirabai's, these religious traditions continue to flourish even today. And this continuity has certain advantages for the historians because it allows the historian to compare the contemporary practices with those which have been described in the textual traditions or shown in old paintings and to trace these changes. But at the same time, this also becomes a problem because often contemporary people today who are following certain practices may not accept that perhaps the practices might have been quite different in the earlier period and there has been a change over time. So, the challenge for the historian is to undertake investigations with sensitivity while at the same time recognizing that religious traditions, like other traditions, are dynamic and change over time. I hope this discussion was useful for you. I wish you all the best. Bye.